So maybe, like I did for the last panel, I'll talk a little bit just about how the story at least came to Saud, or at least came to me personally. My parents immigrated from India in the late 1960s. I grew up in Michigan for the most part. And growing up, really knew nothing about South Asian American history, to be quite honest with you. It was really only in college, maybe after college even, that I began first learning about stories of South Asians that dated back before my parents' own immigration experience, which was in the late 1960s. And it was completely transformative for me personally to begin to learn about these stories. And one of the stories that completely blew my mind at the time was the story of Congressman Dalip Singh Saund, who was the first South Asian, first Asian American elected to national office in this country in 1956. Congressman Saund came to the United States in 1920, and you'll be hearing much more about his story in just a minute. But I thought I would start actually by sharing with you a video clip. This is an interview with Congressman Saund that was conducted in 1959, where he talks about his own experiences, how it is that he came from relatively humble beginnings growing up in Punjab to becoming the first South Asian elected to national office in the US. I'll play about 3 minutes of the clip and then I'll turn it over to Eric, who is Congressman Saund's grandson, and Dr. Manan Desai, who I'll talk about in just a second as well. I'm going to play this clip for you.
Answer to your question. I have settled in Imperial County since 1926 as a farmer. I was a PhD in mathematics, but because I could not become citizen of the United States, I could not find a teaching job. But I was satisfied as a farmer in the Imperial Valley, the only way I could make a living. While I was farming, I never let my interest in national and international affairs slow down. I was always interested in American political life. When I became a citizen of the United States on December 16, 1949, it was my ambition to run for public office. I ran for the office of Judge of the Justice Court of the small town where I had lived for 25 years. Everyone thought that I had no chance. It was not possible for a Hindu to be elected judge. But I had faith in the American sense of justice and fair play. I campaigned hard and I was elected. Then I was not allowed to sit because I had not been a citizen of the United States for 1 year. And I ran again in 1952 and I served as Judge of the Justice Court for 4 years. In the meantime, in 1954, I had been elected as county chairman of the Democratic Central Committee of the County of Imperial. Then I had the opportunity to help in the campaign of the Democratic nominee for Congress in 1954. I became intrigued with that work. Then in 1956, I amazed everybody when I announced my candidacy. From then on, the story is well known. I lived in Imperial County, which has only 20% of the population of the district. And the larger county, Riverside, had 80% of the population. And to be frank with you, I did not know more than 12 persons in the Riverside County when I became a candidate. But it was simply amazing how scores of American men and women came over to help me by giving of their time and money. I had a very difficult campaign, but with the help of my American friends and with the astonishment of everybody, I was elected to the Congress of the United States.
So Eric, you and I first met, I think, in 2008, actually. Very soon after we had started SADA, and Eric lives in the Bay Area. We met over lunch, and I was so fascinated to learn more about the family story, but also about the legacy of Congressman Saund and the archive. And I'm sure you'll be sharing more about that story in a minute. But I wanted to share this photograph. I think this is you sitting on Congressman Saund's lap. Is that right? In this photograph, that's you. His lap. Do you remember when this photograph was taken? Do you happen to know?
This would have been about 1960, because my brother Neil is about 1, and he's over there.
Terrific. Well, and I also wanted to mention that Manan was one of our early board members, and if you've used SADA and the archive, Manan is the one who personally created a lot of the metadata, a lot of the early materials that we had. Probably added an extra year to your PhD because you're spending all your time creating metadata. But Manan has been such an important contributor and collaborator for SADA, and so I'm so glad to have you both on the panel today.
So thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. It's kind of incredible to be a part of this entire program, to hear the stories from the last panel, and to share the panel with Eric. So I've come to Dalip Singh Saund's story. I teach Asian American history and Asian American literature, and so you know, Dalip Singh Saund's obviously this really important figure within the longer story of South Asian Americans, Asians in the United States, and so on. And right now I've been working on an essay to kind of think about how Saund fits within the larger South Asian American story, as well as what story does he tell about immigration, U.S. government, and the U.S. more globally. So I wanted to just kind of give a little bit of context and then read a bit from the essay that I've been working on. So the first thing to kind of think about is that Saund in some ways is a bridge between this earlier period of immigration and exclusion and this later period. So some people are saying that, you know, like the 1965 Immigration Act was when the kind of floodgates of open for South Asian immigrants, but Saund's career kind of really existed within this middle period where there's a lot of exclusion. So he arrived in 1919, just as a series of immigration acts had closed the door to migrants from Asia, and by the end of his life, in 1973, the US had opened its doors. And so that's one context I've been thinking a lot about. And the second is the Cold War. So as Saund is elected in 1956, he's also being upheld as an example of American democracy, a step forward in the larger struggle against racism in American society. He goes on a tour in Asia, which we can talk more about, and he often comes across this question about the Little Rock Nine. So the civil rights movement is on the minds of people in Asia. And as Saund is kind of going through Asia, talking about the civil rights struggle, he's often sort of thinking about his own story as, you know, an example of some progress. This is also important because in the 1950s, the U.S. is increasingly concerned about the role of India. And you know, the U.S. Cold War, you can think about containment policy. That more generally, the U.S. wants to support governments who would fight against the Soviets, disavow communism, and very stubbornly, India decides not to say anything, right? Like they're part of the non-aligned movement. And in his memoir, her autobiography in 1960, Saund also talks about the kind of great reception of Khrushchev in India, which made a lot of Americans nervous. So the third thing that I've been thinking a lot about, and this is what the part of the essay that I want to read, talks about how he navigates racism during his election campaign. And I think this has so much resonance with, you know, when we're thinking about new voices, new faces in American government. It's kind of incredible to think about his entire campaign. So I'll just read for, I think, a couple pages. On November 6, 1956, after a hard-fought campaign against a well-connected and heavily favored opponent, Dalip Singh Saund was elected as representative of California's 29th district. Winning by a margin of 3,300 votes, Saund's victory was deemed a historical upset, the first time a Democrat had won in the ultra-conservative, that was the words he used, Republican stronghold, the first time a person from Asia had been elected into the US Congress. It was a sort of election result that seemed to portend a new United States. It just demonstrates that America is real, Saund told a reporter for the Chicago Tribune shortly after his win. Born to a Sikh family in Chhajalwadi, Punjab, sorry if I mispronounced that, Saund had come to the US in 1919 as a 20-year-old graduate student at Berkeley. His arrival came at a critical crossroads in the history of South Asians in the US. At the turn of the century, an initial wave of Punjabi migrants, I don't have to really tell this crowd, mostly men and mostly Sikh, had settled along the west coast of Canada and the US, many migrating farther south to the Imperial Valley after facing violence and discrimination in the Pacific Northwest. 1913 marked the birth of the California-based radical organization, the Ghadar Party, which advocated the overthrow of British rule in India and was made up of many of those same migrants. But by the time Saund arrived, some of the revolutionary ferment had been suppressed by US and British authorities. making way to a long period of legislative exclusion. The 1917 Asiatic Barred Zone Act had effectively restricted immigration from all of Asia, and just as Saund had enrolled in his PhD program, the 1923 U.S. Erskine Supreme Court case had slammed the door shut for Indians who hoped to gain citizenship in the U.S., denaturalizing those who had already obtained it. In his writing, Saund explains how the citizenship laws impeded his ability to teach at a university, and so he traveled to the Imperial Valley in Southern California, where he joined a community of farmers and began a new life in the fields. So in the decades that followed, Saund found success in Southern California. He married Marian Kosa, a graduate of Berkeley herself, and a daughter of Czech immigrants, together raising 3 children. He ran a successful farming and fertilizer business. It also was subject to the California alien land laws, which as a non-citizen prevented South Asian immigrants from owning or leasing the land they had cultivated. He writes in his memoir, quote, "I saw that the bars of citizenship were shut tight against me." These hardships perhaps were at the root of his decision to enter a life of public service. By the 1940s, he founded the Hindustan Association of America to petition for rights to American citizenship, eventually lending support for the Luce Seller Act of '46, which granted South Asians the right to naturalize and allowed a small trickle of Indian migrants entry after decades of exclusion. In 1953, just a few years after becoming a U.S. citizen, Saund won his first election, being elected as judge of Westmoreland Township, I believe, and by 1956, he successfully ran for Congress. Saund launched his campaign for Congress in the fall of 1955. In his memoir, he described how he had debated with his campaign committee over how his name ought to appear on the ballot, whether he used the title doctor, being a PhD, or judge. They settled on Judge D.S. Saund, and while he doesn't explicitly mention it in the memoir, the name deletes the obvious markers that would have outed him as Indian. Nevertheless, his name and his identity as an Indian-born immigrant were immediately exploited by his opponents as a liability during the race. As one of 2 Democrats running for the seat, Saund faced a smear campaign from his fellow party member Carl Kegley, the former Deputy Attorney General for California. Kegley attempted to disqualify Saund on the grounds that he had not been a U.S. citizen for 7 years. Saund was undeterred, as he writes in his memoir, quote, "I was not in the least disturbed by my opponent's move. If elected in November 1956, I would not take office until January 1957, by which time, Saund explains, he would have been citizen for 7 years and 16 days. Saund's account of his campaign is continuously marked by his unflappable and unrelenting optimism. Setbacks become opportunities, attacks provide chances to demonstrate his civility. He was previously unknown in Riverside County. He explains that his opponent's attempt to disqualify him backfired as Saund's name, which was previously unknown in Riverside County, began to appear in the county's newspaper headlines. These retellings make way for a moral in his memoir, often in the form of a maxim about American character and more than once using a boxing metaphor. In his memoir, Saund tallies all the political tricks up Carl Kegley's sleeve. Kegley quoted passages out of context from Saund's 1930 book, My Mother India, which was a response to Catherine Mayo's 1927 book, Mother India, which was like a muckraking, pro-imperialist propaganda. And this was an effort to characterize Saund as a dangerous radical. Kegley also ran a virulent full-page ad in the newspapers of both counties that was allegedly so libelous that 3 leading dailies refused to print it. As for his Republican, that was just the Democrats, right? As for his Republican opponent, Saund described how every effort was made to make it appear that I was an Indian, not an American. Ads would print Dalip Singh in big letters and Saund in small letters. When the initial field of 7 had winnowed down to just 2, Saund and the Republican Jackie Cochran Odlum, the national media took a special interest in the campaign. California's 29th district had become the unlikely electoral battleground for a new America. Gone was the old white male guard, in its place a contest between the successful self-made white woman against the self-made Asian immigrant. And I'm reading this, this is my own interpretation from a lot of the magazines of the time. Time portrayed the contest as a land of contrast, the judge versus Jackie, the coffee-skinned man with blue-black hair against the platinum-blonde orphan-turned-aviatrix and cosmetics businesswoman. Odlum was like a really pioneering pilot. Another publication, a little less optimistic about Saund's chances, described it as the battle between, quote, the lioness and the mouse. Saund's shoestring campaign budget was up against her big money and connections, including President Eisenhower and her husband, the financier Floyd Odlum. In his memoir, Sound doubled down on the David and Goliath themes, explaining how his campaign through neighborhood barbecues, while Odlum threw giant fundraisers hosted by the likes of Bob Hope, with cameos from canine megastar Rin Tin Tin. Sound's Indianness was a liability not only because it marked him as a racial outsider, but because the Cold War context had rendered his Indianness into a specifically political kind of threat. In his televised debates with Odlum, he notes, the geopolitics of the Cold War would quickly surface. Odlum drew on Cold War fears of a red Asia by subtly insinuating that Sound may very well be a foreign agent. So Manchurian candidate-like ideas here. In one debate, he recalls how Odlum dragged the Prime Minister of India, Mr. Nehru, saying that he was leaning towards the communists and would certainly like to have a man from India elected to the Congress of the United States. These characterizations resemble what the scholar Jody Kim has described as the Cold War melding of the historical Yellow Peril and the modern Red Menace, the racialized fear of Asian migrant labor combining with the political anxieties of a communist Asia. Sound responded as only he could, stating that he owed, quote, no allegiance to any foreign country. Odlum attempted to taint Sound with her unsubstantiated rumor, rendering him both a loyalty risk and security risk if he were to join Congress. For what it's worth, in an interview decades after the election, Odlum maintained her steadfast belief that Sound was a, quote, card-toting communist. Such forms of racism were not new to Sound, who had faced decades of structural racism through US citizenship laws and his fair share of discrimination during earlier political campaigns. During his first campaign to be Westmoreland judge in 1950, his opponent disqualified him on a technicality. Sound also recounts an incident during his 52 campaign where his opponent runs into him at a diner just days before the election. Doc, tell us, his opponent taunts him, if you're elected, will you furnish the turbans or will we have to buy them ourselves in order to come into your court? Sound replies, my friend, I don't care what a man has on top of his head, all I'm interested in what he's got inside of it. These themes are persistent. Sound either deflects the racism through good humor or uses these incidents to portray himself as far more the embodiment of American ideals of fair play than his opponents. Skillful and savvy himself, Sound responded to Jackie Odlum's xenophobia and red baiting by leveraging his racial and diasporic identity as an asset in the ideological battle of the Cold War. So Sound, as we know, won. He had earned 52% of the vote, becoming the first Democrat to win the district, where he would eventually be reelected for 2 more terms. His victory was covered by the major newspapers and publications in the US, where he was already tapped to be the unofficial ambassador to India. And right after he was elected, I think he was asked to give a broadcast to Voice of America, but that was canceled. I don't know the full story of that. Much of the coverage perhaps predictably emphasized Sound's immigrant and racial identity, interpreting his victory as a sure sign of the nation's progress on issues of racial equality. Life magazine described how Sound had faced considerable odds, not in the least because his opponent was not above making an issue of Sound's race and religion, publicly wondering if the color of his skin would inspire the powerful Southern Democratic congressional leaders to ignore him. The New York Times described how Sound's walnut skin threatened to handicap him in a race-conscious section of America, and Time magazine similarly added that his victory occurred in the longtime Republican 29th district, where Asians have not always been happily tolerated. Yet after his election, Sound was cast as the epitome of American success as the US continued to promote an image of racial progress. Sound's successful election as the first Indian-born, first Asian, and first Sikh was cited as evidence of a new post-war ideal, tolerance towards racial and religious difference. In a column titled, this was kind of true, but not always true. So in a column titled, The Advice to a Sikh Congressman, the Chicago Daily Tribune described Sound as a, quote, detribalized Sikh, claiming that he may revert to the costume and customs of his former country, where most Sikhs never shave and always conceal their uncut hair beneath a gay turban. And even after his re-election, I was finding these kind of newspaper clippings. Sound would face attacks that would insinuate again that he was a dangerous radical because he spoke against the British, and that he was kind of in a certain way using a race card. But Sound's victory also was interpreted as an affirmation of American democracy, the nation overcoming its legacies of anti-Asian racism, and in the West Coast no less, which had historically been a center stage for anxieties and violence against Asian immigrants. Sound himself spoke of the shifting demographics and changing view in California, writing that, quote, prejudice and discrimination against the Hindus and Orientals were to be found largely among the older people, but there was little or no trace of it among the younger generation. A new America, in other words, was being ushered in the 50s, and with that, a new and more diverse electorate. One magazine observed that Sound received heavy support among his district's minority groups, Mexican Americans, African Americans, and a few East Indians, along with the farm vote. And as Sound himself put it, his election was proof of, quote, new winds blowing. So I'll end there.
All right, that's I think a really interesting, great summary of the historical perspective, and I'm going to offer a more family perspective. I have basically three things to cover. I'll say a bit about the family itself and how my grandfather, and I'm going to call him Bapu, by the way, because we always called, that's how we knew the guy. So, and I think that means father in some Indian language. We'll talk about, I'll say a bit about how Bapu's impact has evolved in the family. I'll say a bit about the archives, and then finally I'll close with a few notes about an event that happened in 2007. It was an unveiling of a portrait in the US Capitol of Dalip Singh, and that was an interesting thing. I'll say a few words about that. All right, so just first of all, just a little more context. My grandfather and grandmother had 3 children. The youngest daughter still lives, and she's in Pasadena, and there were 8 grandchildren, and 7 are still living of those. And most of the grandchildren are in California, and a large number of them went into the music business, such as a business as it is. It's hard to make your way in music, but they're very good musicians. I can say that very little Indian culture made it through the generations to the grandchildren, and even the children themselves. Only 2 things we called Bapu Bapu, and we always made curry cauliflower at Thanksgiving. And I think the story about that is it's very easy to make, and it's the only thing he could cook. And that's what we always make, that is a family recipe. But other than that, there's no traditions, no stories, no religion, nothing of India made its way to the grandchildren at all, really. I discovered Indian classical music when I was in college, and but never heard it in our house. My dad loved music, but he didn't. Indian music wasn't a thing in the 60s, I guess. Although I must say that I learned that from my son, who traveled to India and hung out in the university for some university program, said that of all the Indian students he met, most of them had never heard of Indian classical music themselves either. Bollywood, yes, of course, but not classical music. There was certainly a remaining interest in political activity in the family, although only my Aunt Julie, that's the second child, had a real talent for it, and she was elected to the school board in San Diego and served there. And we all, just like with Bapu, the family joining the campaign, we all went door to door in San Diego helping Julie get elected. As far as main contact with the old country, well, all of us are very mixed, right? In India, we tend to call it, somebody says, where are you from? Most of us say, well, I'm 1/4 Indian, and then everybody will say, well, let's see, can I see that? Oh, maybe, kind of picture it. But that's the most prominent nationality, because Bapu is the most famous, although my great uncle, Maisie's, my grandmother's stepbrother, was also a fairly prominent person. He was an artist. And they were, in a sense, they were great buddies to each other. And that's how my grandmother and grandfather met, is through my uncle Emil. And then they kind of kept this sort of friendly rivalry going through the years of who could outdo whom with their public achievements. And that's what I remember at the house in Hollywood, when we'd have dinners there. But as far as our Indian relatives, they're upper middle class, and they come over to the United States from time to time. My uncle Carnell, who's Bapu's younger brother, used to come to the US about once a year in the 1960s, and had great friends and many contacts here. Might hear about that later. I'm in touch with some of the grandchildren, Facebook friends with some of the grandchildren in India. Some of my cousins keep much closer contact, you know, go to weddings there and so forth. So our own recollection of my grandfather is very spotty, because he had a couple of strokes in the late 1950s, and then he had a big stroke that incapacitated him when I was 4 years old. So I'm the oldest grandchild, and so I have the best recollection of him. I do remember him before the stroke. Most of the others, I think, don't. So most of our memories of Bapu was he was in bed in the house in Hollywood, and he couldn't speak. He could only move the left side of his body. You could talk to him. He could understand and, you know, nod his head, shake hands with his left hand. But he was not able to really produce, you know, intellectual material. We tried to get him to, you know, write out letters on a board. He was not able to do that. He did have a television with a remote. It was an audio remote at that time. It made a little sound. And so he was watching public affairs on the television every day. And certainly, you know, if we were there on a Sunday, he'd be watching Face the Nation, at which he had appeared on himself. And so he, from his bed, had to witnessed the Kennedy assassination, the Civil Rights Movement, Martin Luther King's death, and all of that, but having to remain silent himself about it. I think it's very clear that at least the half of his brain that was still fully active seemed to understand what was going on with regard to that. So, from the family point of view, I would say that we kind of, you know, being a child growing up in this kind of environment, this kind of a famous grandparent, we recognized that there was something special there. My grandmother certainly had lots and lots of stories about her time in Washington, and having herself grown up, you know, from fairly humble beginnings. This was her time in the sun, and so she just relished being, you know, dressing up and meeting important people, and she had lots and lots of stories about that time. To the grandchildren, we kind of took it in stride. We knew it was special, and but not much was made of it through most of the 1960s, 70s, and in the 1980s, and the 1990s, its attention started to pick up a bit. And I think what happened was that you know, the Civil Rights Movement happened in the 60s, and then mainly among African Americans, and then other ethnic groups took interest in their own ethnic identities, and maybe starting in the 90s, and so there were rallies, you know, for each community to find your own heroes. So people started to look to Bapu as being a hero of having done this extraordinary thing, and won such an improbable election, as we've heard. So we, during this period, then we, you know, we started to get some of the materials together. Now, unfortunately, what happened after his stroke was a whole bunch of his office, you know, in Washington was packed up and shipped wholesale out to a one-room house in the Imperial Valley. And it sat for a few years while everybody was, you know, figuring, what do we do? And then over the years, that got transported from one place to another, whittled down, and now there's a lot less, I think, than we would like of the material that he generated during his time in Congress, and so the historical material. Still, moving on to the archives, I do maintain the archives of about 5 World War II ammunition crates and a bunch more boxes. And there were some people who in Imperial Valley who kept really, really good records or clipped all the newspapers that they could find. So there's a lot of material to sort through, and so I'm really grateful to Sada for taking interest, and I think it is the sort of stuff that properly should be digitized and made more available. A lot of boring stuff in there, a lot of interesting little tidbits, you know, a note from Richard Nixon or John F. Kennedy. I've been through everything. I have not found any communist membership card, so I don't think that's the case as far as I know. I can say that for a period, I would contacted, many times a year, people wanted permission to use Bapu's portrait, you know, portraits on the website to use in a textbook. So, you know, some middle school textbook or something. So I think that he appears in many textbooks. I know that if you become a naturalized citizen, he's in that book as one of the success stories of immigrants. And I'm you know, myself, quite happy to make available these materials to people to you know, make the heroes who they want to be heroes. On the other hand, I'm a little bit ambivalent myself, because I'm aware from the family lore and from what I read that my grandfather was he was an old-style civil rights advocate. So as we've heard, he believed the content of your character is what, and what's in your head and your heart is what really counts. And that may not be compatible entirely with a champion of one's ethnic identity. Is that the core of their identity is, well, where are you from, what's your nationality? That's something that he embraced, but said that's not important. To him, what's important is what can I do for my district? So in the archives, we've got just tons and tons of stuff where he was on this committee or that committee, worked with Mexico about immigration relations, worked on the water issues in California, worked on the Agua Caliente Indians and their rights to the land around Palm Springs when Palm Springs was developed. So that's, and constant letters, you know, from constituents, you know, I need, my Social Security is not arrived, what can I do about it? So that's the sort of day-to-day work that he felt like was his job. And his job was not to represent any ethnic community, it was to represent the United States of America. So I frankly don't know what he would make of what people would, you know, today and in the future would want to do with championing him as an Indian American, and that's who he is. All right, finally, let me tell you about the portrait. So, you know, the way Washington works is the Congress people are, you know, they're working with their constituents, they're doing deals with each other, but a lot of work happens through their legislative aides, the chief of staff and the staff around them. So there's a very famous congressman whose name I might mention in a little while, who had an Indo-American aide named Dino Tepera. It happened to be a Republican, and but he was very interested in my grandfather because from the connection to India. So in the 2000s, he proposed that a portrait be hung in the Capitol. So that was eventually passed and commissioned, and they hired an artist, a pretty well-known artist, painted a portrait, and then there was going to be an unveiling. And so there was an opportunity for the family to go out and see this event, and my kids were teenagers then, so it was a great chance for them to see Washington. They met Nancy Pelosi and many other dignitaries. It happened to be on a day when French President Nicolas Sarkozy was giving an address to the joint session of Congress, so that was very, very special. It was just a wonderful time. And there was a room about this size where the portrait was being unveiled, and lots of people, television cameras, the congressmen rushing in and out. They had floor votes, and I walked in with a speech. I was ready with prepared remarks, and Norma Manetta said, "We got to go vote." "Oh, you can talk. Go here, push me in front of the microphone. So give your speech." So I'm going to tell you the speech that I gave to this group, and basically it's my interpretation of the 5 ingredients to Dalip Singh's success and impact, or Bapu. All right. So number 1, first, Bapu was very smart. So any mind that can master mathematics, agriculture, business, law, public affairs, and politics has got to be quite impressive. In that regard, my grandfather was very lucky. That's what he was born with. You're lucky. That's luck. That's not something you do. But number 2, he made the most of his gifts through hard work, both in physical labor, operating a hay baler, and in the library studying and writing. He pressed forward every minute of the day. And in the archives, I have notes, which are obviously taken from reading some out of a book in some library. He spent a lot of time in the library. Third, Dalip Singh was outward-looking and dedicated to public service. From his upbringing by enlightened parents in this small village in India, he acquired humanist values that by doing good for the community, all else flows. And he was certainly ambitious personally, but his ambition was always focused through a dedication to justice and fair play for all. And that's what I think comes out in everything you can see that he wrote. All right, fourth, my grandfather was extremely optimistic. So certainly he met barriers and he acknowledged them, but he did not dwell on them. Instead, he looked past obstacles and reasoned his way around them. So to that kind of American, it didn't matter where a person was from, the color of their skin, or the religion they were born into. What mattered was the content of the heart and what's in their head. And that served him well when representing the United States on the world tour, which we've heard about. And finally, the fifth ingredient to Dalip Singh's success was that he married the right person. Many people today are faced with tremendous difficulty in dividing their attention between career and family, and that's a perennial problem, and it's especially been a perennial problem for women in the workplace when, as the barriers have crumbled since the women's movement of the 1970s. So while Bapu looked outward, our grandmother, Marian Kosa was equally intelligent and optimistic, but she dedicated herself to the business of the family. So in some sense, that might have been a sacrifice. She was in medical school at UCLA when she married my grandfather, so she sacrificed that to move to Imperial Valley. But we have to thank her for that. But the dedication to family paid off because, certainly for my grandfather, because when the election came around, it was the family that pounded the pavement and went door to door, as well as his friends and associates who made the election really happen. So as you can see from the television interview, and if you see the whole interview, Dalip Singh thought pretty highly of himself. But my grandmother was formidable enough to temper that, and I think everybody needs that, who has a high opinion of themselves. And there's a story from a newspaper where he was in a room full of senators and dignitaries, and he came away with my grandmother afterwards, and he said, "Wow, there were just a lot of great men in that room." And she said, "Yes, there certainly were, my dear, but one fewer than you think." So they teased one another, and after his stroke, my grandmother cared for Bapu with selfless dedication. It was just quite remarkable. She called him your lordship, and I assure you that was quite sarcastic. All right, so, and then after this, that was my few minutes in the microphone. So after that, I thanked everybody and said some nice things about the portrait. It's just a great experience that shows that, that anyone who works hard and with focus and dedication to a good cause can generate a cascade of good energy to pass on to future generations. So that's what I take from the legacy of Dalip Singh Saund.
We have a few minutes for questions if we're ready.
I have one comment, sir. I met your grandfather in Amritsar
Oh.
in 50s. He came there.
Oh, when he, on his trip to when he was the round the world trip.
If I'm not mistaken, his brother's name was Karnal Singh.
Yes, Karnal,
He
yes.
was a very great engineer of the railways.
That's correct,
And
yes.
it was in newspaper stories. So when he came to India, it was publicized. My mother wanted to see him so bad. So she connected, established some connections. And message came that he's going to come to Golden Temple and we could meet him there. So I complimented my mother. I was a naive person at that time, young person. My mother did all the talking. And his wife and 2 daughters were with him.
One daughter, yes.
One
Ellie,
daughter
yes,
was there.
yes.
And they talked a lot in Punjabi. I was looking at his face and the way he was talking Punjabi at that time, your grandfather, Dalip Singh Saund. This is one incident I remember. Second is I found his letter where Pandit Nehru came here in America. He wanted him to come to Gurdwara Sacramento. And he said, I don't have time. Now, he wrote it in letter in Punjabi, 2 or 3 pages. I have with me.
Oh.
I think it's in his handwriting. Beautiful handwriting.
Oh.
And so he pursued him to come to that Gurdwara, which was built in 1912. So he produced so many Ghazalites and heroes. And Nehru came there also because of his persuasion of his grandfather. Okay, these 2 things I know about that.
There's a question back there. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thank you very much, both of you, for letting me relive something that I'd been away from for a while. And again, my question is possibly for both of you. When I was in the Imperial Valley, I kept hearing over and over good things in general about his work as a judge. Has either one of you looked into the records of his court cases, or I'm not even sure that he was a sitting judge, or?
What I know about that is, or I've heard about that, is that there was a red light district in Brawley, I believe it was. And when he came in, he threw the book at the patrons and their clients, and that was appreciated by some people and not by others.
Yeah, that was the infamous case. You know, you talk about Judge Saund down there, and that's the first thing you're told. But several people told me, and I'm thinking Joe Anderholt, who was of the Swiss community there, and there's another gentleman who was a farmer there in the Japanese families. So from a wide variety of people, I was told that because of his work as a judge, he got re-elected several times, and that's where his popularity came from. And apparently he used to advise farmers as a judge too.
Interesting.
So I didn't have time to look into that, so I was wondering if we could look at court records or if you have anything in the archives.
I have nothing in the archives from the judge period.
Maybe we
really,
should,
yeah.
if I have time.
Yeah,
I'd
it'd
love
be-
to take a look at the court records and see, you know, because
Very
3
interesting.
terms.
Or even the newspaper, like newspaper databases may be the place to find that stuff as well. I mean, what I know is also from the
Newspaper.
his memoir. Like he has a whole chapter about the campaign to become
Right.
judge or justice of peace, and then he talks about that case as well. But yeah, I think that's something to look into.
Yeah, that's
for
the
sure.
one everyone talks about.
Yeah.
But it'd be great to look at public records,
Mhm.
because some of these cases didn't make it into the newspapers.
Mhm.
This is what, and I've forgotten now. I mean, I was given like the odd, I remember one where he advised somebody who was going to trial, or there was some, I think, dispute over land, and he,
I have not heard of it.
yeah.
There's
So-
but this is when he was in Congress about the land dispute with Agua Caliente Kulia Indians, right? But this sounds like something
This
That would be
is very-
before
this,
this,
right?
But that apparently is where his popularity came from.
Makes sense, yeah.
People from all
Yeah.
communities used to consult him or.
And yet that would have only been the Imperial Valley, so there must have been something else that allowed him to succeed in Riverside where he was not known.
But a lot of people in the Imperial Valley owned property in Riverside. There
Ah.
was a lot. That's why it eventually became the same district or something like that.
Okay, maybe one last question? Yeah.
Yeah, this is really cool. So interesting. I didn't know anything about this. I was actually curious when he, or I was wondering whether he mentored any future politicians or maybe even other industries. Like, did his success spawn maybe other Indian Americans or non-Indian Americans, I guess, as well, in careers in politics?
He was only there for 3 terms, so he started out being mentored, and he acknowledged many people were so good to him when he went to Washington. He was just overwhelmed with the goodwill. I'm not aware of anyone that he mentored. Of course, one thing that mystifies me about this whole period is that there'll be records of him being in Stockton and Berkeley and Southern California. Travel was a lot harder then. He had a Buick, but the roads were not. It wasn't just like a drive down the freeway. It was like an ordeal. And they'd go to Yosemite for vacations and stuff. So I think that just the logistics of mentoring someone at a distance would have been much more difficult. And I'm not aware of any persons that, younger person in politics or anything like that you would have mentored. He had a lot of associates, he had business people who ran a business for him, stuff like that. I don't know if that's quite the same realms with.
Yeah, last question.
This is Dr. Amarjit Singh Marwa, and he actually worked on the campaign when he ran for Congress. Unfortunately, we're having a hearing issue, so maybe at lunch you could talk to Dr. Marwa with your specific questions because his memory is really, really good. It's much better than mine, and obviously I'm younger. Dr. Marwa is one of those leaders in our community, and I'm so proud that we're here together celebrating this. What you said about not knowing anything about India growing up is the same thing that I grew up with. In fact, I think my dad was told to not talk about it, to become American, and to blend in. And so to have people who retain that and are a bridge to our elders and our history is so precious. I would also like you to make sure you tell us your website so that we can visit your website address.
Well, if you just type Dalip Singh in a browser, you'll find it.
Okay.
It's sand.org.
Okay.
Easy to find.
Have you
Eric-
uploaded the memoir?
Yeah, Eric has
Yeah.
made available a lot of the texts and images and other archival materials on his website.
Yeah, some of the best is.
Daddy, give me this. Your grandfather, Eric. I've known of him way, way back. I knew the family from India. I never saw him, but I've known the family from early 1900. I've not been born there. His younger brother is Dalip Singh.
Okay.
And we go back way back. Because my own uncle, Dalip Singh, was the chief engineer of India, English time. Dalip took over from him in 1947. So our relationship with the family was way back. We used to hear about Dr. Dalip Singh Saund when he came as a student. But I saw him only first time in this country in 1955. I was a graduate student in Chicago at that time. I flew in with the Maharaja of Patiala to see the people in Imperial Valley. And that's how first time I met him. Although I had known Imperial Valley in 54, I came for 2 weeks to visit another family friend, Samaras. So then, he was like an uncle to me. So then I used to coming in every year. I was like a little boy for him. Used to remind me of working on the elections. It was a bombshell for the country of the United States when you won. At that time, we all went down back to Washington, D.C. it was a bombshell. People were finished. The country was finished. However, a non-white American came to the Congress of the United States. Nobody is allowed. First minority Congress of the United States who break a barrier. So you could be proud by him. He went to Temecula, post office in his name, and others, and he was the greatest orator. You couldn't have a better orator than him. That's how he won the first election. He would go to every church, every place in his whiteboard. And I used to hide myself as a little boy for him. So, to help him. Every year I came down up and there on. This I know him. You can pay respect to this man who took a barrier to the Congress of the United States Congress. First man. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric and Dr. Desai. Thank you so much, Dr. Morrow. We'll have an entire conversation with Dr. Morrow this afternoon as well. So we'll take a break now for lunch.